I'm Ethan Carter, 36, and I run a small custom furniture shop in suburban Ohio. Last Saturday, I woke at dawn to smoke rings rising from my backyard smoker. I'd invited my wife Lauren's whole family for a spring feast, her parents, her brother Nathan, his wife Claire, and her younger sister Sophie, who's finishing her master's. By mid-afternoon, the deck was spotless, the picnic table lined with our fine china, and the brisket smelled like a promise. Lauren buzzed around arranging flowers and polishing her parents' crystal. Everything had to be flawless. I loved her zeal even when it made me nervous. Around 5:00 p.m., I realized we were 2 chairs short. I slipped out the side door toward the garage boots crunching on gravel. As I rounded the corner, I froze. Nathan stood by the tool rack, arms crossed, voice low. Lauren was beside him, cigarette in hand, odd since she quit years ago. "I still can't believe you married this guy," Nathan sneered. "Dad was right. You should have dumped him before the biology phase." Lauren exhaled smoke and laughed. "I'm on it. My lawyer says I could take half of Ethan's shop his whole future." They shared a look that felt like a punch to my chest. My name echoed in my head. I backed away, heart pounding, and grabbed the 2 folding chairs. Stepping back inside, I practiced the most genuine smile I could muster. I set the chairs by the table, greeted my in-laws with a warm, "Good to see you," and poured the first glass of iced tea. I laughed at Dad's corny jokes, carved the brisket, and told Sophie how proud I was of her thesis work. But behind my smile, my thoughts raced. Lauren's laughter still hovered in my ears. How long had they been planning this? Why had she let me host her family only to stab me in the back? 3 days later, my phone erupted 47 WhatsApp messages from Lauren, each one more desperate than the last. Something was terribly off. I should have confronted her that night. Instead, I poured another drink and kept playing the perfect host. As twilight fell, I wandered to the porch, took a deep breath, and realized nothing would ever feel normal again. I woke to the low hum of my workshop's fluorescent light, the scent of fresh pine shavings still heavy in the air. My rough hands, those same hands Lauren's family once mocked, hovered over the half-finished rocking chair I'd been carving for Sophie's graduation. Outside the window, the old oak in our yard stretched its limbs like a silent witness to everything I'd built: the deck, the furniture, and the life I thought we shared. My chest tightened as I remembered their laughter echoing in the garage, the way Nathan spat my name like a curse, and Lauren smoked in my sanctuary. I set the lathe on idle and ran my palm along the curve of a spindle, feeling the grain shift beneath my fingers. Each knot in the wood reminded me of the tangled lies they wove behind my back. I wanted to smash this chair, throw the metal tools to the floor, but something cooler took hold, a hardened resolve that outlived the betrayal. I exhaled and picked up my phone, 47 messages, blinking, each more frantic than the last. I wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. My plan started now in the quiet scent of pine and oil. But the first move felt like stepping onto a rickety scaffold, every nut and bolt threatening to give. And I knew if I misstepped, the whole structure would collapse beneath me. By mid-morning, I was sitting across from Maggie Larson, my attorney, my sounding board, at a corner table in the cafe where nobody knew my name. Steam curled from my mug as I showed her the screenshots, Lauren's texts to Dominic, the hidden bank statements, the lawyer's notes planning the divorce. Maggie tapped her pen against her pad, brow furrowed. "This is intricate, Ethan. They've designed a paper trail to make you look negligent, but it's fixable." I felt a spark of hope, quickly tempered by the risky truth fighting back meant burning every bridge with the people I once called family. I'd have to dig into records, call favors from suppliers, maybe even confront Nathan, and watch him squirm under the weight of his own deceit. The stakes were heavy: ruin my business reputation or let Lauren's plan unfold. I watched a drop of coffee creep down the side of the cup, thinking how one small spill could stain everything: my livelihood, my pride. Maggie's eyes met mine. "Ready to lock this down?" she asked. My pulse thundered. I nodded, knowing the fight ahead would demand more than tools and timber. It would test the steel in my spine. That afternoon, I drove to my accounting firm, the sun bleaching the gravel road until it looked like sifted flour. In the passenger seat, I carried a battered briefcase stuffed with invoices, bank statements, and handwritten ledgers. Inside, the smell of old paper mingled with diesel fumes, a reminder of the miles I'd driven building this shop from scratch. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. I realized then how invisible I'd become to people who assumed a guy in jeans couldn't run a thriving business. In the conference room, I laid out the inconsistencies Maggie and I had uncovered: misstated payments, phantom expenses, transfers that didn't match any job site. "They want a forensic accountant to chew through this and drag us into court for months," I said. My voice sounded flat even to me. "So we show them it's all legitimate." My CPA. Ben nodded his glasses, catching the light like tiny headlights. "We can accelerate your supplier payments, prepay some contracts, tighten those ledgers up. It'll cost you, but it'll bleed them dry in countersuits." I leaned back, feeling the leather chair creak under my weight. Class conflict had followed me here, white-collar advisors against the blue-collar carpenter who never finished college. It was a battle of beliefs, their world of pristine spreadsheets versus my world of sawdust and sweat. But I was determined to prove that real work had value no number could erase. Yet even as I agreed to Ben's plan, I wondered if the cost would be my last scrap of peace. On the drive home, the radio crackled with a story about a local family suing a neighbor over fence damage, another petty feud blown into public spectacle. I smirked, thinking how easily people believed rumors when they suited their agenda. When I pulled into my driveway, Sophie was waiting by the gate, her master's hood slung over her arm. Her eyes were red, and she didn't greet me with her usual warm smile. Instead, she held out her phone. "I needed to tell you," she began, voice trembling. I followed her into the kitchen, the spring sunlight painting diamond shapes on the floor. Sophie said she'd overheard more at their dad's office. Lauren and Nathan had met after my dinner, discussing an even darker twist: ice-cold, calculating revenge disguised as divorce. My jaw tightened. Sophie's heat of youth conviction collided with my seasoned anger. She slid a thumb drive across the counter. "They keep recordings of our conversations. They plan to use my testimony against you, say you're unstable, a danger to her career." I uncapped a pen and scribbled notes, heart hammering. Sophie's tears trailed down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't stand it anymore." In that moment, the sister I thought I knew became my secret ally, but exposing her would tear her family apart. I stared at the drive, dread twisting in my gut. Trusting her felt like stepping off that same scaffold, and I couldn't see if there was a net below. That evening, I walked to the barn behind the house, the lantern light casting long shadows across my tools. I found the old skein of twine I'd used to hang a chime under the oak, the bell I'd wired for gentle summer breezes. I'd left it there so every evening we'd remember calm moments. Tonight, I retrieved it, held the bell in my palm, and imagined its sound clear, unbroken, unafraid. Then I chucked it against the barn wall. The bell bounced and cracked metal, ringing with a warped echo. My chest heaved as shards of peace scattered on the dirt floor. Symbolic actions, some say only art can express raw truth. Maybe so. I grabbed my phone and called Ben. "Let's draw up that emergency partnership agreement, lock down the intellectual property, my shop's designs. No more apertures for them to slip through." My voice was steadier now, but the risk gnawed at me. Locking the doors on Lauren meant I'd also shut her out utterly. As I stepped back into the night, the barn door creaked like a wound reopening. I knew every choice would bleed me dry in its own way. Under the street lamp's glare, I parked next to Sophie's Prius and waited. She emerged, wrapping her arms around herself as though the spring air had turned to ice. We slipped into the 24-hour diner and occupied a corner booth, leather seats cracked with age. Coffee steamed between us, carbs and sugar fighting the bitter taste of betrayal. She slid over a stack of papers, recordings, transcripts, even a receipt showing Lauren paid a security deposit for a downtown office near Dominic's firm. They're building an alibi and a narrative that I'm the unstable one protecting my sister from a crazy ex. They'll claim everything you're doing is emotional rage. I felt anger and pity twist together. We'll flip the narrative, I said, voice low. We'll show the lawyer they're gaslighting you to get to me. Sophie's shoulders sagged. I'll testify, but you might have to break their trust first, show that I'm not just some pawn. I sipped the thick diner coffee, letting the warmth chase away the numbness in my veins. The waitress refilled our cups without a word. Around us, couples laughed, late-night drunks slurred apologies into their plates. In this bright public solitude, we plotted a private war. But any move I made for Sophie risked exposing her to her family's wrath, and theirs was fierce. Back home, the moon draped silver across the deck as I unlocked the front door. I paused in the hallway mirror. The man who stared back had steel in his jaw and frost in his eyes. I touched my reflection, gripped the door frame, and realized I was no longer the man who'd poured wine for her parents just days ago. The oak outside groaned under a spring breeze, leaves whispering secrets. I traced the glass of the front window with a fingertip as if the barrier between my world and theirs was paper thin. Then I slipped my thumb drive into my laptop and watched Lauren's secretly recorded call, her voice soft and dismissive, labeling me a volatile artisan. I rewound and listened again, each repetition chipping away at the man I used to be. Eventually, I minimized the window, shut the laptop, and exhaled. I had the evidence. I had the plan. But I felt an ache deep in my bones, a break in the foundation no amount of revenge could cement back together. Tomorrow, I would issue the invitation for the so-called investor meeting, my final gambit to draw them in and reveal everything. I sat alone in the dark, the hammer and chisel set untouched on my workbench, feeling the true weight of what I was about to destroy, believing I had no choice but to build anew on these shattered stones. I spent the morning drafting the invitation for our investor meeting, each word chosen to sound urgent, but not alarming. I slipped Lauren's email address onto the CC line alongside her parents, Nathan and Claire, and added Maggie and Ben as silent BCCs. The subject line read, Urgent Partnership Opportunity, tonight 7 p.m. It was perfect, vague enough to pique their curiosity, concrete enough to demand attendance. I imagined the click as they opened it, hearts skipping beats, minds whirring with possibilities. Behind me, the workshop's dust motes drifted in shafts of afternoon light, each one a reminder that everything I'd built here was on the brink of ruin or renaissance. I hovered over the send button, fingers trembling. This was no mere dinner. It was a trap shaped like hope, a stage for my reckoning, and I was both playwright and executioner. With a final deep breath, I pressed send, watching the status change to delivered. Now there was no turning back. By evening, the dining room looked like a gallery exhibit of my life's work. The long oak table, handcrafted, sanded to a silky matte finish, stood center, surrounded by 6 chairs I'd reupholstered in designer fabric. On each place, I set a leather-bound folder stamped with our business logo. Inside, beneath crisp transparency sheets, lay the first hints of evidence, bank statements, dated contracts, and a few cryptic quotes from Lauren's lawyer. In the corner, I angled the projector toward the blank wall, a sleek black box sitting among the fine china like an improbable spy tool. On the windowsill, I placed a single white rose symbol of truth and the fragility of new beginnings. The air smelled of jasmine from the candles I'd lit on the mantel, a scent I knew Lauren's mother adored. Every detail was intentional, weaving social symbols, luxury linens clashing with my rough-hewn table. The rose echoing my vow of honest transformation into a visual puzzle they couldn't ignore. When I stepped back to survey the scene, my reflection in the sideboard looked unfamiliar, confident, dangerous, ready to reveal secrets that would fracture more than wood. At 7 sharp, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. I opened the front door to find Lauren immaculate in a pencil skirt and blouse clutching her own leather portfolio. She looked at the table, then at me, her lips parting in a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Behind her, Pamela adjusted her pearl necklace as Elijah brushed sawdust from his trousers, odd, given he'd never set foot in my workshop before. Nathan and Claire followed, hands linked. Nathan's jaw clenched whenever his gaze flicked to the folders. Sophie arrived last, shoulders hunched but eyes bright, as if she carried a secret map in her pocket. I welcomed them in with firm handshakes and guided them to their seats like an auctioneer unveiling rare treasures. The Rose sat at my own place, glinting under the chandelier, a silent witness to the storm to come. The room hummed with polite tension, the kind that crackles before lightning strikes. I rose, cleared my throat, and raised a water glass. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," I began, voice steady. "I know you came expecting news of an investor, but tonight we're here to discuss something more personal, something that affects all of us." On cue, I pressed a button and the projector flared to life. The first slide emblazoned with their faces caught in candid moments. Lauren and Nathan laughing over coffee, Lauren dropping off her car at Dominic's garage. Gasps filled the room. "These aren't marketing images," I said. "They're evidence." Lauren's hand fell from her chin. Nathan's face paled. Pamela's knuckles whitened around her purse. "I'd ask for an explanation," I said, "but I've heard it all before." I clicked again. This slide showed bank transfers to a hidden account and text messages time-stamped through our anniversary dinner. Voices crackled from the laptop speakers, Lauren's polite tones as she spoke to her lawyer. Nathan's mocking laugh that once drove me to fix leaks in my truck's exhaust. Claire slumped into her chair. Sophie covered her mouth. Then Elijah stood and bellowed, "Stop this." But I played the next clip, Lauren admitting she planned to divorce me and take half the business. His anger ricocheted off the walls like a hammer. As the last note of evidence displayed, I watched Lauren's composure slip, her well-rehearsed calm replaced by raw fear. And I felt both triumph and a pang of something I couldn't name, pity perhaps, or the weight of victory still to come. Before the uproar could fully explode, Sophie stood. Her voice trembled like a crack in glass. "Please let me speak." Silence fell. She dropped her own folder onto the table, flicked it open, and placed a recording device next to mine. "I wanted to protect her," she said, eyes glistening. "But they threatened me that I'd lose my tuition funding my relationship with her." She pressed play. Her recorded conversation with Pamela spilled into the room, Lauren's mother urging her to secure status, Nathan advising legal manipulation, Pamela's voice dripping with entitlement. It was a social indictment, the haves imposing wills on those they claimed to love. The clip ended, and Pamela shrank into her pearls. Elijah's face a storm of shame. "I didn't want to be complicit," Sophie whispered. "But I'm not a pawn." Lauren's shoulders slumped as the mirror of her own choices reflected back. Her lips quivered, but the room no longer belonged to her. In that breathless moment, I realized revenge was never just about me. It was about unmasking a whole house of cards, and now the foundation was cracking beneath them. The room's electric silence shattered as the front door creaked open and a woman stepped in, Rachel, Dominic's wife, eyes fixed on Lauren. In her hand, she held thicker folders, manila envelopes that spilled with divorce filings, extramarital confessions, a second set of secret bank statements. She glanced at me, offering a small, wry nod. "I hope I didn't interrupt," she said softly, voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd woken too late to a lie. Heads turned, shock rippled outward. Elijah tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't obey. Lauren gasped, looking between me and Rachel as their betrayal collided in the same room. "He's been doing this to women for years," Rachel added, her gaze hard as flint. "I thought our marriage was solid until I found his pattern." Papers fluttered like wounded birds across the table, evidence of Dominic's own schemes, and a note about Lauren's complicity. The symmetry was devastating, the deceiver deceived. I looked at Lauren, the woman I thought I knew, and saw her crumple. The guests leaned forward, eyes hungry for more. In that final moment of revelation, any plan I had seemed small against the tidal wave of truth that had broken through every wall. The table, once a stage for my confrontation, now felt like the apex of a moral reckoning, and I realized I was no longer in control of the narrative. The next move would define all our futures, but who would make it? After the hush settled and Rachel's entrance left the room suspended between outrage and disbelief, I felt a tremor run beneath my ribs. I sank into my chair, fingers grazing the cracked leather of the rose I'd smashed against the barn wall days before. The bloom's white petals, once symbols of fragile hope, now lay scattered like spilled truths across the tabletop. Around me, Elijah's face was ashen. Pamela's pearls trembled against her throat, and Nathan's gaze flickered to his wife Claire, whose eyes brimmed with regret. Sophie sat rigid, clutching her phone as though it held the last piece of refuge. Lauren's lips parted, but no words came. In that charged silence, I realized the story had become larger than any of us. Their social standing, their financial pedigree, the myth of the perfect family all lay in ruin. I could stand up and unleash everything I'd filed against them, let the court of public opinion devour these charades, but doing so might mar my own integrity. Could I wield truth without becoming the very architect of destruction I'd condemned? The question anchored in my chest, heavier than guilt, colder than revenge's first spark. Was there a line I still refused to cross? When Lauren finally inhaled, voice brittle as old plaster, she stammered something about a misunderstanding, a moment of weakness, a promise to fix everything. I stood the folders rustling like restless spirits under my palm. My jaw tightened around the thrum of contradiction. This woman had been my partner, my confidant, the one I built my life for. Now she offered fractured apologies and conditional promises. I traced the rim of my glass water refracting the chandelier's light in fractured prisms. Instead of answering, I packed away the projector, tucked the evidence into my briefcase, and walked them all to the door without another word. The front hall's echo swallowed their footsteps, and the click of the lock felt like a verdict. Alone, I leaned against the frame, pulse hammering. I'd orchestrated this reckoning, but had I surrendered my own moral compass in the process? The thought gnawed like rust on steel, leaving me unsteady and uncertain about the next move. By midnight, I was in my workshop, the air thick with the scent of cedar and linseed oil, the hum of the lathe echoing like a heartbeat. I called Sam Turner, the retired craftsman who taught me to read wood like a soul's grain. When he answered, I barely recognized his gravelly tone, softened by age, but sharp with curiosity. I poured out the story, betrayals, evidence, legal threats, the collapse of everything I'd believed about love and loyalty. He listened, silent but attentive, until I ran dry of words. "You remind me of a forest fire, Ethan," he said finally, voice low. "Fires clear old growth, but scorch everything in their path. You'll get new sprouts, but only if the ground can breathe afterwards. Revenge might feel righteous, but make sure you're not setting your own home ablaze." His metaphor settled like seed in my mind, stirring a conflict I hadn't let surface. Was I rebuilding or merely raising darkness pressed against the windows as I weighed his warning? If I cooled the flames too soon, would the charred remnants still support new life? Or would lingering embers ignite into something I couldn't contain? At dawn, I drafted a letter to the local chronicle under the guise of a commentary on small business trials. My thumb hovered over the keys as I described the corrosive power of entitlement, the silent toll of betrayal, and the underappreciated labor that builds communities. I included an unsigned paragraph about a furniture maker whose workshop fell victim to legal maneuvers and social manipulation. The pen became saw and hammer, breaking down facades, building public scrutiny. But sending it would expose my own wounds to the world, leaving my brand vulnerable to gossip and scorn. Could I risk my shop's hard-won reputation on the altar of truth? As the sky pale blushed, I saved the draft and stared at the blinking cursor heartbeat echoing the risk. If I published the story, would spread beyond this house, beyond ex-in-laws, into the court of public opinion, and there was no turning back once the ink dried. My finger trembled above the send button, caught between duty to honesty and need for self-preservation. Later that afternoon, I met with Inspector Reyes, a steel-eyed woman in her 40s who'd once shut down a derelict mill for failing code. I watched her stride across my gravel drive toward Dominic's refurbished auto shop. I'd tipped her off about faulty wiring and unpermitted expansions, breadcrumbs leading to a trap. As dusk settled, she'd find enough violations to impose heavy fines or a temporary closure. Symbolically shutting down their facade of respectability felt like leveling their ivory tower with a wrecking ball. Yet every citation carried risk. If my tip was traced back to me, they'd sue for defamation. I gripped my phone in my pocket, weighing whose collision I wanted more, my in-laws' wrath or Dominic's vengeance. The social rebellion was sweet, but the potential blowback was sharper than chisels. I whispered into the still air, let fairness be weaponized, but at what cost would justice arrive? That evening, over cinnamon lattes at the corner coffee shop, Sophie and Rachel huddled across from me. The air smelled of espresso and rain-slicked concrete. Sophie's eyes had shed the sheen of tears and hardened into determined slits, while Rachel's posture radiated calm resilience. We spread maps of court dates and recorded statements on the laminate table. Sophie slid over a bullet point list of threats she'd received from Nathan if she testified, and Rachel supplied Dominic's filing labeled rebuttal evidence. I folded their papers together, symbolizing unlikely unity between sisters and a betrayed spouse. We formed a tiny triad of defiance against the fortress of entitlement. A barista refilled our cups without breaking stride, as if brewing solidarity with every pour. Yet beneath our solidarity flickered a question: would the justice we sought become another form of cage? And when we emerged victorious, would we recognize the people we'd become or be haunted by the tactics that carried us there? The next morning, at Dominic's shop, I arrived as a prospective buyer, blueprints in hand and a veneer of curiosity. Beneath the counter, I slipped a micro camera into a gap in the cabinetry I'd spotted weeks ago. My pulse thumped louder than the rock music playing overhead as I feigned interest in custom bumpers, scanning walls for compliance certificates. When Dominic himself appeared slick in a tailored suit that reeked of corporate conspiracy, he offered me coffee. I nodded, voice calm, but head buzzing with adrenaline. Every handshake felt like a gamble, each smile a concealed bluff. As he led me to the back office, I kept the camera rolling, hoping to catch conversations that would nullify his charmed veneer. Suddenly he paused, gaze distant, and muttered, "You don't really need these," waving at the blueprints. The air shifted, and I knew the risk had escalated. Had he recognized my wagon wheel pendant or traced the wood grain on my jacket back to my workshop? The next words out of his mouth would decide if I walked out with evidence or walked into a trap I couldn't escape. By nightfall, I retreated to the oak bench beneath our splintered rosebush, the broken petals half swallowed by grass. I lit a single candle on the bench arm, its flame flickering against the gathering gloom. Flames, Sam had warned, could forge or destroy. I opened my pocket knife and carved a small replica of the fallen bell from a scrap of cherry wood. Each incised line echoed memory and warning that even a shattered piece could be reshaped if wielded with care. Sparks from the candle flame wavered across the benchboard, the thin line between creation and consumption. I closed my eyes, hearing the distant hum of the lathe, and saw the faces of those I fought against and with. I felt a shift in the marrow of my bones. This war had become an act of faith, a test of whether I believed in justice or only my own capacity for retaliation. The night held its breath, waiting for me to choose which path to carve next. At dawn's first light, I unraveled plans on the new lot I'd purchased, a parcel of land across town, closer to my supplier network, untouched by old memories. On the paper foundation, trenches glimmered in pencil, the shape of my next workshop pressed into grid lines. This was more than architecture. It was the blueprint of renewal. I imagined walls stripped of past betrayals, windows framing honest sunlight instead of shadows. As I marked the pouring point for concrete, my phone buzzed with a single line. Settlement offer $200K plus return of the house. Signed by Friday. I stared at the text, the weight of its simplicity crushing. They wanted to buy my silence, to sweep the upheaval under a fiscal rug. Could I trade my newfound clarity for cash? And if I refused, what havoc would their lawyers unleash? The earth under my feet seemed to tremble in expectant suspense. Standing on the empty lot, I inhaled cold air tinged with possibilities. The oak workshop was a memory my old life dismantled. But here, amid the unbroken turf, the future waited in green hush. The fallen bell in my pocket and the carved cherry wood in my hand felt like talismans, reminders that I could forge beauty from broken things. Yet the settlement's pen hanging over me felt like a guillotine, promising relief but demanding surrender. I glanced at the horizon where dawn bled into sky and felt the stir of conviction. I'd risk my livelihood, my reputation, everything I'd bled to build, because some truths demanded more than compromise. As sunlight crowned the field, I tapped out a response. "I'll see you in court." The message slid away on the network, irreversible. And in that final silent moment before the world awakened, I knew the foundation I laid today would define not just my business, but the truth I chose to live by. At first light, the wind carried the scent of fresh earth and rain over the bare plot of land I'd claimed as my future. I stood with my boots sinking into soft loam hammer in hand and rolled blueprints unfurled at my feet. The new workshop's foundation outlines, drawn in charcoal pencil on white grid paper, felt less like lines and more like hope etched on the world. I knelt, traced the trench where concrete would flow, and imagined the walls rising, each beam a testament to resilience. Around me lay tools I'd scavenged from yard sales: a battered wheelbarrow, a rust-speckled shovel, a coil of galvanized wire, symbols of my refusal to let privilege gatekeep success. But in that quiet dawn, I noticed footprints not my own, a pair of polished Oxfords pressed into the mud near the property line. My pulse spiked. Had Lauren's family already sent someone to intimidate me, to leave a silent threat? I snapped to my feet, scanning the tree line for movement. Each shadow a whisper of conflict yet to come. By mid-morning, I'd posted a polite notice on the neighborhood board declaring my permit application was pending and inviting local artisans to observe the build. I believed in transparency, but that invitation was also a lure. Around noon, I heard the thunderous roar of a diesel engine as a bulldozer rumbled onto the site chassis, dripping hydraulic fluid. My heart lurched. No permit had been granted yet. I sprinted toward the machine, wrenching at the door until a burly operator climbed down and glared at me. "Got orders to clear this for a new duplex development," he growled, eyes flicking to the blueprints. My mouth went dry. Had Lauren's parents leveraged some behind-the-scenes deal, I leaned close, voice low but firm. "This land belongs to me legally. Ask your boss for paperwork." He snorted, pointed at his phone. A text from an unknown number showed a map of the lot stamped, "Authorized demolition." My knees shook. The risk was escalating beyond boardrooms and court filings. It had become a raw battle for ground itself. As I stood toe-to-toe with the machine, I knew every second lost eroded the dream I'd sketched in the muddy dawn. 2 days later, I found myself in the mahogany-paneled courtroom of Judge Moreno, whose reputation for strict fairness both comforted and unnerved me. I walked in wearing my workshop's logo on a pressed chambray shirt, carrying a leather satchel, bristling with evidence my clean titles, invoices paid in full, and photographs of the bulldozer poised like a war machine on my land. Opposite me, Lauren sat flanked by high-powered attorneys in tailored suits that gleamed with corporate confidence. Sophie and Rachel slid into seats in the gallery, their presence a silent anchor. The bailiff called the session to order, the gavel's rap echoing like a hammer striking truth. As the judge reviewed the demurrer I'd filed to stop the tearing away of my foundation, I felt a swell of conviction. Every allele of my working-class DNA rebelled against the notion that money could bulldoze justice. Yet when the judge lowered his glasses and asked Lauren's counsel if they had counter-evidence, I realized they'd produced a sworn affidavit claiming I'd neglected the site, that standing water and fallen logs created safety hazards. My blood ran cold had my morning rain and leftover cedar logs been twisted into proof of negligence. The next question hung in the air. Could I dismantle their narrative before my dream turned to dust? Before I could respond, Sophie rose from the gallery. Her voice, though soft, carried to every corner of the room. "Your Honor, if I may speak." The room quivered with surprise as she stepped forward. She held a soaked cedar plank, muddy but intact, and slapped it on the counsel table. "These logs weren't left as hazards, they were part of a ritual I suggested," she explained, eyes flicking to Lauren's attorney. "We were performing a ground blessing ceremony for Ethan's new workshop. I invited neighbors to place symbolic logs, their own reclaimed wood, to honor community building. They signed a registry." She handed a clipboard of signatures to the bailiff. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Neighbors, I recognized their names scribbled in ink. The judge peered over his glasses and Lauren's counsel paled. By reframing potential evidence of neglect as social ritual, Sophie had not only nullified their claim but exposed how easily privilege manipulates narratives. The twist left everyone reeling. Lauren's cheeks flushed with shame as Sophie returned to her seat, and I felt the ground shift beneath what little doubt remained. After the hearing, I walked through the courthouse foyer with Sophie and Rachel. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting us in fractured rainbows of verdicts yet to be delivered. Rachel nodded at a newspaper kiosk, displaying my photo beneath the headline, "Carpenter versus Capital Local Shop Owner Fights for His Ground." The irony was delicious. Publicity was a double-edged tool. I placed my palm against the cool marble wall and felt a tremor in my chest. My fight had become a public spectacle, yet every story printed meant more community eyes watching my every move. Sophie squeezed my arm. "You did good," she said quietly, but her voice held its own echo of risk. Across the lobby, 2 reporters gravitated toward us like moths. My gaze lingered on their recorders before I whispered, "Not yet." The seeds of social justice had been planted, but watering them would demand sacrifices I wouldn't fully understand until chapters ahead. That evening, back at the burned rosebush stump, I lit the single candle again, setting it in the cracked petals as though resurrecting the bell's echo. My phone buzzed. Maggie's name glowed on the screen. We spoke in hushed tones over the crackle of wind through the broken branches. She'd scheduled a preliminary injunction hearing, my next risk arguing why a temporary halt to Lauren's asset dissipation trumps her right to mobility. Every court date carved another notch in my soul. "Remember," she urged, "show your work literally, bring your tools, show the craftsmanship behind your ledgers, make them see labor is value." I traced the candle's flame with a bone-deep understanding justice needed both light and heat to forge change. But as I hung up, I realized the risk now sat on a razor's edge, leaned too far into retaliation, and I'd become the mirror image of the selfish husband I loathed. The open flame wavered in the night air, and I sensed the moment of truth approaching. Dawn cracked too soon, and I accepted Maggie's call to appear in Judge Moreno's chamber for an informal conference. Under the judge's stern gaze, we hashed out the emergency motion. I watched Lauren's attorney argue that the injunction amounted to economic coercion. My chest tightened. Denying her access to assets meant confessing I believed she'd misused them. I drew in a breath that felt like inhaling oak dust, and spoke-up voice measured. "Your Honor, this is not about revenge. It's about preserving the foundation of honest enterprise. If her actions continue unchecked, the business community will lose faith in due process. The judge's eyes softened, and he agreed to hear my motion, fully scheduling a hearing for the end of the week. Exiting the chamber, I felt the weight of victory tempered by the knowledge that each legal victory stakes my reputation on a public stage. Out in the hallway, Sophie and Rachel flanked me, and together we stepped into fluorescent light, uncertain if the world we rebuilt would be bright enough to outshine the debris left behind. It was a turning point. I could keep hammering at injustice or risk hammering myself into ruin. That night, I returned to the new lot carrying a weathered wooden crate filled with hammers, chisels, and nails, my personal toolkit and a symbol of honest labor. I laid each tool atop the blueprint-lined table under the moon's pale glow. Around me, shadows pooled like spilled ink, and I imagined hands reaching from the darkness to snatch away my arsenal. With deliberate slowness, I began driving a stake into the ground, marking the southeast corner of the foundation. Each blow echoed through the stillness, a heartbeat that stitched my resolve into the earth itself. The stake rose upright, splitting the soft soil like a new birth. As I wiped sweat from my brow, I felt something settle in my bones. No amount of court battles or sabotage could unearth the truth rooted beneath my hands. Tomorrow, I would awake to the sound of concrete mixers and hammers and step onto a foundation I'd staked with more than wood and steel. It held my pledge to rebuild on fractured ground. The first light of dawn would find me ready for the next gamble, come what may. I arrived at Judge Moreno's courtroom just after dawn, the late winter sun slicing through the high windows in pale shafts of light that danced across the polished oak benches. My breath came steady and measured, each inhalation a reminder of the years I'd spent breathing in sawdust and varnish. Across the aisle, Lauren sat, draped in black silk, flanked by two sharp-suited attorneys who whispered in clipped tones every time my name was mentioned. Sophie and Rachel occupied the gallery seats behind me, their presence a silent bulwark against the uncertainty of what would come next. I ran my fingertips over the embossed leather of my chambray-shirted armrest, recalling Sam's warning about fires and regrowth, knowing now this hearing would decide whether I could keep the land beneath my feet or watch the bulldozers return to swallow my new foundation. The air in the courtroom thrummed with anticipation, and as the bailiff rapped his gavel, I felt the weight of every choice I'd made coalesce into a single moment of reckoning. The proceedings began with Lauren's counsel presenting a last-minute affidavit from a purported expert who claimed the site had unsanitary water runoff and unmarked hazards evidence. They argued that I'd endangered public safety by inviting neighbors to participate in my build. My heart thumped like a jackhammer, each blow a reminder that even good faith gestures could be twisted into liability. When they finished, the judge turned to me, eyebrows raised, and said, "Mr. Carter, your response." I rose and laid out the stack of affidavits from local volunteers, the registry Sophie had organized, and photographs of the ground blessing ceremony. I spoke calmly, my voice carving through the courtroom's tension, recasting the logs and standing water as symbols of communal solidarity rather than negligence. Then I revealed a final twist, a recording of a private call in which Lauren's lawyer suggested embellishing safety concerns to intimidate me into a settlement. The judge paused, reading the transcript on his bench computer, eyes narrowing. As that file decrypted on the court system, I saw Lauren's counsel blanch, and I realized we had shifted the balance of power. The judge leaned forward, pen-tapping paper. "I will consider this new evidence," he said, "and issue my ruling at the end of this session." In that moment, the courtroom floor felt like a precipice, and I wondered whether I could stand the vertigo of victory. An hour later, the judge returned with a firm gaze and a clear voice. "Mr. Carter, the evidence indicates willful intimidation and manipulation by the opposing counsel. The temporary injunction is granted. Ms. Carter's assets related to the furniture shop are hereby frozen pending further review." Gasps echoed through the room. Lauren's face drained of color, and her suitmates sank into their chairs. Sophie exhaled beside me, and Rachel reached over to squeeze my hand, her eyes bright with relief. Yet even as the words echoed, I felt a hand tighten around my heart, because every legal win now demanded a higher toll of endurance. I knew Lauren would appeal her family resources could outlast mine in a long-drawn legal war, and the injunction's protection was only a fragile bubble against the storm of paperwork and countersuits. As I gathered my papers, I felt the precarious weight of momentary triumph, knowing that small victories carried their own hidden pitfalls. That afternoon, I returned to the new workshop site where the first concrete pour was scheduled. The flat, muddy expanse of earth lay like open skin beneath a steel gray sky, ready to receive the lifeblood of my next chapter. Behind me, neighbors had gathered with shovels, wheelbarrows, and well-worn gloves, a motley crew of retired carpenters, stay-at-home parents, learning the feel of rebar, and students from Sophie's program eager to help. I climbed onto the bed of a mixer truck, my work-worn boots steady against the churn of machinery, and addressed them. Today, we set the foundation, not just of timber and steel, but of community trust and honest labor. The crowd cheered, echoing against distant hills. As I directed the pour, each scoop of concrete a symbol of new beginnings, I felt the clash of social contradictions at play, privilege wielded like a bulldozer against my dream, yet here was a tapestry of working-class hands shaping tomorrow. By sunset, the slab glistened like wet stone beneath the dying light, and I realized that physical walls would only stand if the social ones held firm with solidarity and respect. On the third day of framing, Sophie and Rachel joined me under the scaffolding's jagged silhouette. Together, we measured planks, drove nails, and hoisted beams as the crisp air crackled with the scent of spruce and possibility. Between tasks, we talked about the lessons we'd learned, how entitlement can masquerade as authority, how the labor of love often goes unseen, and how forging new alliances could reshape the very soil we walked on. Sophie confessed she wanted to hold community workshops here, teaching sustainable carpentry to kids who might never have thought to pick up a chisel. Rachel mused about using part of the space for a support group for anyone rebuilding after betrayal. Their words were blueprints for a future beyond walls and injunctions, and in their eyes I saw the spark of a different foundation, one built on empathy as much as on concrete and studs. Sam Turner showed up midday, dusty from travel eyes bright with curiosity as he surveyed the half-raised frame. I felt a surge of pride, then a pang of self-doubt had I become too consumed by litigation and symbolism to remember why I started this work. He placed a calloused hand on a vertical brace and nodded. "You've built something real here," he said, voice steady as aged oak. "But don't let the scent of courtroom triumph blind you to the grain of honest craftsmanship. Sometimes you need to let go of fire to let the embers spark new life." He pulled from his pocket a small plank of cherry wood and handed me his carving knife. "Carve your motto," he said. As the blade scored letters into the grain, BUILTONTRUTH, I felt the mantra sink into my blood. We set the plank as a keystone above the workshop's entrance of a silent promise that every join, every dovetail, would reflect integrity rather than vengeance. Midweek, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Lauren. I answered on speaker and heard her voice tentative and raw, offering a final settlement, $200,000 full release of the house, an apology in the local paper if I signed by Friday. She pleaded for closure, promised she'd fought her family for a fair deal. My gut twisted. The offer gleamed like a brass key, tempting me to silence the tumult of my world for cash. But I remembered the wooden bell shards in my barn, the traces of ashes on the rosebush stump, and I realized that money couldn't stitch the wounds betrayal had carved. I responded calmly, "Please direct all offers to my attorney." I ended the call before she could argue. I set the phone face down and stared at the rising frame outside my window, wondering if I'd sacrificed my own chance at peace for this ongoing crusade. Then I texted Sophie and Rachel, inviting them to join me at the site. When they arrived, we clinked water bottles in quiet solidarity, and I said, "This is our future. No price can buy that." Their smiles held relief and expectation in equal measure, and I sensed the shape of hope forming jagged but real. 1 month later, the workshop stood nearly complete, warm cedar siding floorboards sanded to a soft glow and windows framing the orchard beyond. I climbed the steps to the entrance where Sam's carved plank gleamed above the doorframe. In my hand, I held the bell I'd salvaged from the old rosebush, the battered metal now polished, threaded with braided wire, and hung on a wrought iron bracket. With a steady arm, I let it swing. The chime rang clear across the property notes, wavering like a new heartbeat. As the echo faded, I felt the collision of past and future class divides. I'd challenged family ties I'd shattered, and the moral architecture I'd chosen to erect from the rubble. Neighbors paused in their drives. Sophie waved from the framing of the teaching loft. Rachel stood beneath the sash window of the support room, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the town stirred. I exhaled, feeling the crisp air fill my lungs, and realized that while the war for my shop had been won, the greater battle, the one for honest connection and community trust, was just beginning. The workshop door stood open, its threshold both an end and a promise of what lay beyond. Story 2. My name is Leo Adler. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a freelance graphic novelist in downtown Seattle. Last Friday, I received a single-line text from my sister. "Hey, swing by our anniversary dinner if you're free." No invitation, no table assignment, just that throwaway line. My sister, Dahlia Alvarez, 30, has always had a flair for drama. She didn't invite me so much as she mentioned me like a side note. That subtle tone stung more than any outright insult. I arrived at La Scala Bistro at 7:15 p.m. The hostess, Elena Rossi, greeted me with a polite nod. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat chignon. She checked her tablet. No reservation under Adler. She tried again. No luck. She offered a sympathetic smile. "This was more of a pop-in thing," I said, mimicking Dahlia's own words. Elena hesitated. "I'm sorry, there's no seat." Behind her, through the frosted glass panel, I saw the long oak table. White linens, flickering candles. Dahlia sat in the center wearing a deep red dress. Her husband, Marcus Alvarez, 33, raised a glass to her with a grin that was all too proud. My parents, Gerald and Celeste Adler, 62 and 60, sat close, leaning in as if Dahlia had just told the funniest joke in the world. Cousin Felix laughed at something Marcus whispered. I nodded at Elena, turned on my heel, and walked to the bar. The maitre d' gave me the same look, a polite apology. I found an empty stool and sat down. Behind the counter, bartender Javier Cruz polished a row of martini glasses. I caught his eye. "We've known each other since he tended the counter at my old university cafe." "Javi," I said quietly, "send a bottle of the 98 Chateau Saint Rose to table 5 and pair it with their signature truffle risotto. Then slip in the Wagyu sliders." He raised an eyebrow. "You're not at table 5. "Bill it to Dahlia Alvarez," I whispered. Javi smirked. "Coming right up." I ordered a pale ale and tilted back on my stool. The tension in my shoulders eased. I suspected Dahlia was up to something. She never left things to chance. If it was truly their 10-year anniversary, she'd have sent engraved invites. Instead, I got crumbs. That meant a twist was coming. 10 minutes later, I overheard the table gasp. I glanced over. A silver trolley carried the chateau. The sommelier, Johann Becker, lifted the metal lid of the decanter beside Dahlia. He poured until the glass caught every light. Then he placed a dome over a plate in front of Marcus. A moment later, Marcus lifted the lid to reveal Wagyu sliders, each crowned with microgreens. The table applauded. Dahlia shrieked, $2,000, really? Leo? Her voice cut through the low hum of conversation. Silence fell. Heads turned. Nearby diners leaned in curious. I raised my glass. My beer caught the light in little golden sparks. I sipped slowly, savoring the moment. Dahlia stormed over, red dress swishing. Her eyes were fierce like a hawk surprised to see its prey. "You're insane," she hissed. I stood. My own voice carried. "You told me to pop by." "That's exactly what I did." She opened her mouth to retort, but my dad intervened, voice strained. "Leo, don't do this. We're family." "But not enough family to deserve a seat," I replied softly. Her face twisted. "You embarrassed me." I shook my head. "I made sure you can't exclude me in a room full of witnesses." She turned on her heel and retreated to her thunderstruck guests. Marcus swallowed hard. My parents exchanged uneasy glances. The maitre d' hovered nearby, unsure whether to intervene. But I paid my tab cash for the beer. I left a crisp 20 on the bar and walked out. No grand exit, just calm steps into the damp Seattle night. At home, I poured myself another beer. My phone lit up a dozen missed calls from Dahlia, texts from Marcus' dad's voicemail. They all said the same thing. "You went too far." I let it ring. I brewed coffee. The quiet of my apartment felt like a luxury. That's when Tessa Nguyen messaged. She's my editor at Brightline Comics and one of my few true allies. Tessa, 10:12 p.m. Saw the post. You okay? Me, let's talk tomorrow. I needed sleep more than closure. But I knew this was only the overture. Something had shifted. Dahlia underestimated me. She thought I'd crumble. Instead, I felt a flicker of power. I had the receipts, the restaurant bills, plenty of witnesses. I drifted off to the low hum of the city. Dawn would bring new moves, and I planned to play them all. The next morning, the gray light of dawn crept through my blinds as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My phone buzzed with yet another voicemail from Dad, same old lecture about keeping the peace and family unity, and unread texts from Dahlia that grew more furious by the minute. I sat up, heart pounding, wondering when my anger had morphed into something steadier, a cold resolve. I shuffled into the kitchen, poured black coffee into my favorite chipped mug, half the handle missing but still reliable, and ran my thumb over the crack, tracing its silent story. I thought about the way Dahlia had dismissed me the night before, of how she'd circled her precious inner circle like a queen protecting her throne. I realized I'd stepped on her coronation carpet with more force than I'd ever intended. My reflection in the cupboard door was pale eyes ringed with the city's midnight glow. I wondered if I was becoming the sibling I'd always feared, bitter, vengeful, unable to forgive. But forgiveness felt like admitting defeat, and defeat was a luxury I couldn't afford. Somewhere between the last drop of coffee and the voicemail from Aunt Marisol asking if I was truly okay, I made a choice today. I would stop reacting and start acting. I would reclaim my story. I swallowed the final sip, tossed the mug in the sink, and strapped on my coat. Outside, the world was waking oblivious to my private war. As I locked the door, the screen of my phone flashed an unknown number, and I realized I had to answer that call. But something in me hesitated, an instinct I'd never felt before. By mid-morning, I found myself in my studio, a sunlit loft crammed with canvases and sketchbooks that smelled of linseed oil and possibility. I flipped through the latest page of my graphic novel, the one where my protagonist dares to cross a boundary she knows she shouldn't, and I felt a strange kinship. I was writing about risk, yet avoiding it in real life. On my drafting table lay a family portrait in an antique frame. Dad's grin, too wide, Mom's eyes, too bright, Dahlia glowing like the sun at the center, and me standing at the edge, half visible in the shadow. I traced the glass with a fingertip. It felt cool and unyielding. I remembered how Dahlia used to push me aside in childhood photos, elbowing me out of view so she could take center stage. I'd brushed it off, then told myself she was just bold, lauded her charisma even when it evaporated my own sense of worth. But now every slight, every withheld invitation hung over me like a specter. I needed proof, something undeniable. I dug into the drawer and pulled out my laptop, opened our old family group chat logs, and there it was. Dahlia's messages to Mom, Marcus, even Cousin Felix, spelling out intimate gathering and keep it small. My name never appeared. The network of exclusion was explicit. I printed the transcript, stapled it to the restaurant bill, and laid them side by side. The weight of paper felt brutal in my hands. I realized then that I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a direct message from Fiona Blake, Dahlia's college roommate, and once my friend offering a shaky apology. She'd sent a screenshot of a group chat where Dahlia mocked my pop-in surprise and boasted about how easily she'd minimized the nuisance. Alongside the text, Fiona included a photo of Dahlia in the restaurant captured over her shoulder, her lips curved in triumph, my family's laughter frozen in the background. The image pressed itself into my mind like a branding iron. Social rituals, polite manners, the unspoken rules of hospitality, they had all crumbled under Dahlia's ambition. I scrolled through Fiona's words, feeling both validation and unease. Fiona wrote that Dahlia saw me as the family's necessary ghost, someone who could haunt the edges but never occupy the stage. My chest tightened. For years, I'd clung to the belief that blood meant loyalty, that family ties were unbreakable. Now I saw those ties as threads Dahlia could pull or sever at will. I closed my laptop and looked at my reflection in the studio window where the Seattle skyline merged with my unmade bed behind me, and I realized my evidence had become my weapon, and I wasn't sure I wanted to fire it. Night came, and rain tapped a staccato rhythm on the window pane. I paced the hardwood floorboards, each step echoing in the empty room until the buzzer at my door startled me. I peered through the peephole. Marcus stood there, collar turned up against the drizzle, eyes rimmed red like he'd been crying or fighting. He shifted a heavy duffel at his feet. I buzzed him in. He brushed past me into the living room, dripping water onto my rug. The air between us was taut with unspoken truths. "I need your help," he said, voice low. "I can't go back there." His admission landed on me like a thunderclap. Marcus, the golden boy husband, admitting defeat. I gestured to the couch. He sat, fingers lacing into a tight knot. He confessed how Dahlia's demands had hollowed out his confidence, how her contempt for his ordinary life had made him a ghost in his own home. He slid the duffel aside as if to show me its contents, a single toothbrush, a change of clothes, everything he needed to disappear. My heart thudded. Aligning with him risked exposing my own plans, entangling me in a battle that could destroy more than just Dahlia's illusions. And yet offering refuge felt like justice. We both stood at the edge of her world, ready to step off. As the rain softened into a gentle patter, and Marcus looked up with hopeful eyes, I knew partnering with him could change everything or destroy both of us. I spent the rest of the night pacing my living room, Marcus asleep on my couch, the city's streetlights sketching shadows across his tired face. I stared at the family portrait on my bookshelf, our childhood smiles frozen in time while rain drummed on the window. It felt fitting somehow, the storm outside echoing the one building in my chest. I knew inviting Marcus into my home carried risks. If Dahlia found out, she'd unleash her fury with sharp words or worse, legal threats. But doing nothing felt like betrayal, and I wasn't willing to let her write his story anymore. I slipped on my coat, grabbed my keys, and told myself I'd drive him to a safe house somewhere neutral until he could figure out his next move. As I turned out the lights, I realized I was stepping off the edge of certainty and into something unpredictable. The next morning, sunlight crept through a thin sliver of cloud, and I found Marcus already awake, packing a battered duffel bag beside the door. His gratitude was quiet. Small nods murmured thank you. But I saw something deeper in his eyes, a flicker of hope that I hadn't expected to find. We drove in silence, the radio playing soft jazz until we reached a small cabin I'd rented under a false name in the foothills east of the city. It was modest log walls, a wood stove, but it offered privacy, a chance to breathe. As I unloaded our bags, Marcus hesitated, glancing at me like he wasn't sure this was real. I told him change always feels like a dream until you wake up in it. He smiled, brief and tentative. But the moment that should have been relief felt charged like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Inside the cabin, I spread out my evidence on a rickety table. The restaurant bill, the chat logs, Fiona's screenshots, and a folder of letters Dahlia had sent to our parents praising her own sacrifice while undermining Marcus. Every page told the same story, how Dahlia wielded privilege like a weapon, carving out her path while leaving others in her shadow. Marcus ran his fingers over the printouts, his jaw tightening. Then he said something unexpected. "She's suing me for defamation." My heart lurched. This wasn't just emotional warfare anymore. It was legal. Dahlia could hire the best lawyers and toss our lives into court. We'd built our little sanctuary on shaky ground. I tore my eyes from the papers and looked at Marcus. "We'll fight it," I said, though my voice wavered. "We'll show them who she really is." He nodded, but the tremor in his hands told me fear still lived there, and that ours was a battle we couldn't afford to lose. Over the next 2 days, I transformed the cabin into a war room. I mapped out timelines on a corkboard, connected strings between texts and receipts, and drafted statements Marcus could give his attorney. Every night, I lay awake listening to the wind whistle through the trees, imagining Dahlia's demands. Would she call my parents, hire investigators, turn neighbors against us? The social stakes felt enormous in our circle. Reputation was everything, and Dahlia had once held the high ground. Now I was determined to wrest it back. I started writing my own account, a memoir in fragments, weaving facts with the emotional truth of years of sidelining and belittlement. Each sentence strengthened my resolve. Each memory sharpened the cut of betrayal. By dusk on the second day, I realized that while Marcus fought for his name, I was fighting for mine too, but against an opponent who knew every vulnerable seam. And as I pinned the last document to the board, the door creaked open behind me. Dahlia's silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by the cabin's porch light. Her red hair glinted like embers, eyes wild with shock and rage. "You think you can hide?" she snarled, stepping forward in muddy boots. Marcus jumped to his feet, placing himself between us, but I raised a calm hand. "We're not hiding," I said, voice steady. "We're telling the truth." Dahlia laughed, a sound that crackled like broken glass. "The truth. You're a liar, Leo." She pointed at the corkboard where my web of evidence glowed under the single overhead bulb. "Those are lies, concoctions, and Marcus will pay for slandering me." My chest tightened. The legal threat was real, immediate. Marcus looked to me vulnerable and fearful for the first time. But something inside me snapped into place. I wasn't just a ghost. I wasn't just an afterthought. I was the architect of this reckoning. I stepped forward, closing the gap between us, and said, "Then sue me. Sue him. But know that everything here, every word, every receipt, every testimony is a promise that we won't back down." Her face paled, and she recoiled as if she'd poked a hornet's nest. And then she turned and fled into the rainy night, leaving us alone with the echoes of her fury and the knowledge that the next move could shatter all our lives. That night, after Dahlia's silhouette vanished into the rain, Marcus and I sat at the cabin's rickety table under a single flickering lantern. The map of timelines and receipts lay between us like enemy territory, and in the flicker of lamplight, I felt an unfamiliar, quiet confidence settle in my chest. I realized I'd crossed a line. I was no longer the passive ghost. I'd become the architect of my own vengeance. Yet with that power came a new fear. Could I control the storm I'd unleashed? Outside, the tall pine tree shivered in the wind, its needles whispering warnings as if nature itself judged our uprising. My phone buzzed, a single email notification from Dahlia's lawyer titled "Notice of Intent to Sue." My throat tightened. The legal gears were turning, and the next move would decide if we liberated ourselves or buried our lives under litigation. The following morning, we returned to Seattle, the city's steel skyline looming through a veil of drizzle. In the polished lobby of Hawkins & Frey Attorneys at Law, we met our counterpunch, Simone Hawkins, a sharp-eyed partner who made Dahlia's threats feel vulnerable. As Marcus recounted his story, I noticed Simone's jaw set at the word defamation, and I knew she saw an opening. But then she frowned as she reviewed our documents. Your sister quietly transferred her shares in Adler and Alvarez to a Shell LLC, she said, voice low. She's stacking the deck next. She'll claim control of the company. A cold knot formed in my gut. Dahlia had weaponized family legacy trading blood ties for boardroom power. The social contract we'd taken for granted, heritage, loyalty, birthright, had been perverted into leverage against us. Simone tapped her pen. We'll countersue for breach of fiduciary duty, she decided. My pulse raced. We'd risked everything, and now Dahlia had frozen our accounts. The courtroom was beckoning, and with it a public reckoning that could shatter or redeem us. Rain hammered my apartment window as Marcus and I stared at the notice account suspended pending discovery. I rubbed sleep from my eyes and thought of the shattered mirror hanging in my hallway from childhood, its cracks like spiderweb scars. Each shard reflected a fragment of me I'd ignored: shame, anger, pride. Now I placed the notice beside the broken frame and felt the pieces align into a brutal mosaic of truth. With trembling fingers, I poured coffee into the chipped mug I used every morning, watching the dark liquid swirl like storm clouds trapped in ceramic. The steam rose, carrying faint aromas of risk and resolve. Marcus watched me from the doorway, tension etched around his eyes. This could ruin you, he whispered. I lifted the mug and let it slip through my fingers, glass shattering across the floor. The crash echoed, and I realized that some things must be broken to be remade. I grabbed my coat and keys. Today we would fight back in the public arena, and I could only hope our truth was sharper than Dahlia's lies. That afternoon, I called my parents. On the first ring, Dad's gruff voice barked, "Leo, what now?" I took a breath, picturing the boardroom where my parents once presided over our family business with pride. I'm restructuring, I said, calm but unyielding. Dahlia's influence ends today. I've convened the board, effective immediately. Her shares are frozen, voting rights revoked, and all family stipends suspended. Silence crackled through the line like electricity. Celeste's voice wavered. You can't do this to your sister. I bit back the retort, reminding myself not to become Dahlia. I'm doing it for fairness, I said. Her loyalty was conditional. If blood means business, then business must mean loyalty. I hung up before they could guilt-trip me again. In the quiet that followed, I pressed send on the board resolution email. As the confirmation pinged on my screen, I felt the weight of consequence settle in my shoulders. Victory carried its own risks. Outside, thunder rumbled, and I knew Dahlia would retaliate, raising the stakes once more. Weeks later, the smoke of legal battles began to clear. Dahlia's lawsuit floundered under our countersuit, her public image tattered like a moth-eaten flag. Marcus found a new apartment, sunlight flooding through windows he once thought he'd never own. He sent me a photo of him standing on his balcony, arms raised as if greeting a new life, and I felt pride swell in my chest. Yet each triumph tasted bittersweet. I walked the empty halls of our old family office, now stripped of her portraits, the walls echoing with ghosts of who we'd been. In the lobby, an antique chair sat under a skylight, a throne, now unclaimed dust motes dancing in a shaft of light. I ran my fingers over its worn leather and wondered if revenge had cost me more than I'd gained. The city hummed beyond the windows, indifferent to our wounds, and I realized that power was a lonely dominion. As dusk fell and the office lights dimmed, I stood alone in the silence, wondering if I had become the very force I once fought, and if that battle was truly over.